if folks are just joining us again, we want to make sure that you know Thomas Lane has just been sentenced by Judge Paul Magnuson. He received a 2.5-year sentence. Federal prosecutors asking for a maximum of 6.5 years. He received about 30 months. That's 2.5 years plus supervised release for 2 years. This all in connection with violating George Floyd's civil rights. This is Thomas Lane. He's one of the former officers who helped Supervisor Derek Chauvin pin George Floyd to the ground the day Floyd was murdered. Lane was found guilty in federal court of depriving Floyd of his civil rights. Lane has also pleaded guilty to a charge of aiding and abetting manslaughter in a separate case in Hennepin County. Joe Tamburino is a defense attorney without any connection to this case. He's been our legal analyst throughout several trials in Floyd's killing. Joe, were you expecting the federal judge today to go easy on Lane?
What the government requested. The government requested over 5 years, and the judge gave Mr. Lane basically a little over 2 years. So it's definitely lower than what the guidelines call for and what the prosecutor wanted.
Today, we know inside the courtroom there were several victim impact statements. We heard from Floyd's family, his nephew, Brandon, also his brother, Philonise Floyd, weighed in, and Courtney Ross
resources
weighed in as well in this case. Of course, when it comes down to this moment, the judge has pretty much already decided what he's going to do before we're hearing those statements. Is that often the case?
Yes, it is, because before a sentencing happens, the whole process involves what's called a pre-sentence investigation. That's where someone from pretrial services, like probation, goes through the whole matter, interviews the defendant, in this case, Mr. Lane, interviews family members, interviews the victim's family members, gathers a whole host of information, and then goes through the law, the sentencing guidelines, and makes a recommendation to the court. And by the time all of that's done and the court considers sentencing memos from both sides and reviews the pre-sentence report, the judge usually has a good idea what he's going to do.
And we want to make sure, if you're just joining us, just the rundown of what the judge today decided. It's 2.5 years or 30 months in prison. This is for Thomas Lane. And these charges or this sentencing related to violating George Floyd's civil rights. Federal prosecutors had asked for, in this case, 6.5 years in prison. And we know, Joe, going into today, there were a couple of factors, like some signals that I know you picked up on. It was during Chauvin's sentencing when Judge Paul Magnuson, the same judge sentencing Lane, had said that Chauvin ruined the lives of the other officers. And you kind of paid attention to that and said that could be a little bit of a signal for what we might see here today.
Yes, that's correct. Because when the judge said that at Mr. Chauvin's sentencing, if you read between the lines, what he's basically saying is that Mr. Chauvin ruined the lives of these 3 other former officers, basically putting most of the blame on Mr. Chauvin. So with that said, one could only conclude that the judge would give a lighter sentence to the other 3. Now, Mr. Lane, he's in the best position for the best type of sentence. Why? Well, because he only had 1 conviction. The other 2 had 2 convictions because there were 2 counts. And Mr. Lane was one of the persons who was saying at the time they were subduing Mr. Floyd, maybe we should turn him over. Maybe we should turn Mr. Floyd off of his side. So he was in the best position to get the best sentence.
And we did hear from the judge today that the judge said that he believed that Lane should have intervened and he should have stepped in to provide assistance.
Yes, we did hear the judge say that. The judge made some analogies, too, about he gave some analogy of a physician second guessing as to whether or not he should have said something to a more senior physician in some type of medical procedure. But the judge clearly said that these officers did have a duty to intervene, and they failed in that duty.
And we want to talk about just some of the other parts of this decision today. In addition to the 2.5 years, we know that he will have 2 years of supervised release once he is released from prison. In addition to that, we know that Lane is ordered not to commit crimes. There's no drug testing requirement with this sentence. And also we're told he cannot own firearms and has an order to not have any contact with the victims in this case. Any elements of that surprising, or is it standard for what you might see? What can you tell us about those points?
Those are all very standard conditions. And the 2-year supervised release is basically almost like a probation status after you get out of prison. So after he's released from prison, and he probably will be released in about 2 years, maybe a little more, he will have 2 years of being under court supervision, where he has to check in, maintain employment, or go to school, where he has to remain law-abiding and have no contact, obviously, with the victim's family members. But those are all standard conditions.
And we know today the defense had wanted the court to reduce the sentence to 27 months. They believe that would be about the same sentence Lane would receive in his state sentencing. We know that is coming up on September the 21st. The prosecution argued that Lane should not receive a lighter sentence because they did not feel he had taken responsibility for his actions. When you look at the decision that was made, of course, in a case like this, you can't make everyone happy. How do you factor in where the judge landed on this decision?
Well, he almost gave the defense the number that they wished. I mean, he almost did that. There's only a few months different in what the defense wanted and what the judge gave them. But I think what the judge was trying to balance is Lane's minor role, if you could say that, in this whole situation. Lane is in a position, because he mentioned those statements about turning Mr. Floyd over, that's better than, say, the others. The only other one that you could argue really has even a more minor role would be Mr. Tao. Why? Because Mr. Tao never touched Mr. Floyd. He was away from the situation. He was basically being a traffic cop, trying to keep people on the sidewalk and not intervening. However, Mr. Tao was a police officer for a much longer period of time than Mr. King and Mr. Lane. But I think the judge has to balance all of that. And when he did, he obviously decided that a 2.5-year sentence is appropriate.
And of course, these cases, you can't make everyone happy in this type of situation. So certainly we'll be waiting to hear more reaction from both sides now that the judge's decision has been handed down. Of course, at this time, what can you tell us about this judge? I know this particular judge, he was involved in Chauvin's sentencing as well. Chauvin received 21 years for the same violation as Lane was sentenced for today. What can you tell us about this particular judge, his time on the bench, what you know about him?
Well, Judge Magnuson is a very highly respected judge in federal court. There's no doubt about that. He's been around for a long time, since basically the first Reagan administration in the early 80s. He's been a judge longer than we've had the sentencing guidelines, which came into effect in 1986 approximately. He's known as a very smart, intelligent judge, and he's also a judge that basically gets to work. Yeah, he doesn't spend a lot of time using around. He gets right to the point. And as you could tell, even in his sentencing hearings aren't long. I mean, these are big cases. And basically, he goes through a sentencing hearing within 40, 45 minutes. So he's a no-nonsense person, very well respected, very intelligent, very experienced jurist.
And we're getting word that the judge recommending Lane serve his time at the Duluth facility. Is there anything you can tell us about that facility, that kind of decision? What does that mean?
Well, obviously, no one wants to go to prison. But if you had to go to prison, you would pick the Duluth facility. The Duluth facility is unlike what you would normally think of as a prison. They don't have prison walls like you see around, St. Cloud or in Stillwater. They have fencing, obviously. And they have basically separate housing, almost like cottage type situations where the inmates sleep in there. And then they have jobs and tasks and work to do. When you get to Duluth, you're only there because you're serving a shorter sentence, say something less than 5 years usually, and you are a low-risk person. So if you're someone who has a violent history or someone who has had problems in other prisons, you're not going to get to Duluth. But someone might, like Mr. Lane, who obviously has a clean criminal record, he obviously is someone who, is going to be able to abide by rules. Going into Duluth would be the best situation for him.
All right. And Joe, if folks are just joining us again, we want to make sure that you know Thomas Lane has just been sentenced by Judge Paul Magnuson. He received a 2.5-year sentence. Federal prosecutors asking for a maximum of 6.5 years. He received about 30 months. That's 2.5 years plus supervised release for 2 years. This all in connection with violating George Floyd's civil rights. Again, Joe, if you could tell us, weighing in on this decision by the court. Can't make everyone happy, but this is where the judge landed in this.
Yes, and that's a good statement that you can't make everyone happy. Obviously, this was an extremely tragic situation, but I think what the court had to balance out is the main actor, the person who is ultimately responsible for the whole situation, Mr. Chauvin. He's already sentenced him to 21 years. And at that sentencing, as we all know, the judge told Mr. Chauvin that he ruined the lives of these other men, these other former officers, which gave us a signal that he would treat those other officers differently than Mr. Chauvin and probably more leniently. And in this situation with Mr. Lane, being the person who at the time that they were subduing Mr. Floyd said, I think we should turn him over, he was in the best position to get the lightest sentence.
All right. Thank you so much, Joe, for joining us.